There is a special family who lived at one time in my college church. Peace Community Church, an American Baptist and Alliance of Baptist affiliated collection of activists, dissidents, loving friends, and hospitable peacemakers, meets within an old building in Oberlin, Ohio. The stairs sag and creak. The plaster on the bathroom ceilings is falling down. The carpets in the fellowship hall are stained. The pipes in the kitchen have burst so many times during the Ohio winter that you can only get a trickle of water through there anymore. The stained glass windows are faded and show spider vein cracks. And there is a family of bats in the balcony. This kind of sounds like the children's books that begin, "If you give a mouse a cookie," or "If you give a moose a muffin." Mine would go, "If you have some bats in the balcony." And to be sure, chaos ensues. But these bats didn't really disturb much, honestly. They did frighten the older Sunday school teacher as she took the children to their class one morning, and they wound up having Sunday school in the fellowship hall, away from the flying creatures. They flapped around during an Advent organ concert. They caused my dear pastor, Steve, to get more exercise than he bargained for as he attempted to shoo them out. But maybe these bats came to hear the word, just like you and I are here today. To be sure, the church bats lived in the house of God and found happiness there, even if only for a short time. These bats had found a home in our church, much like the sparrow and the swallow who nest beside the altar of God, if a little bit more sinister. Psalm 84 reminds us that God is a particular God, caring about even where individual sparrows nest and preparing a place for the sparrow to hatch her eggs near the altar of the Lord. The sparrow, too, and the bat can nest in God's house. Now, I think of sparrows as pretty standard animals. I see a lot of them in cities and lighting on houses, and I don't really think about them that often. But sparrows have been through a lot as a species. When I was using that good old sermon prep tool called Google, I ran across a story about the Four Pests campaign in China. Mao Zedong and other leaders at the beginning of the Great Leap Forward in the 50s encouraged citizens to exterminate all sparrows, which were seen as enemies of progress because they would feed on farm fields and decrease production. They were even called public animals of capitalism because they would take more than their share of the harvest. Citizens would bang pots and pans out in the street to discourage the birds from landing. This was so successful that many birds just fell from the sky out of sheer exhaustion. Sparrow nests were destroyed, eggs crushed, young drowned, and flying sparrows simply shot down. Rewards were given for the largest number of sparrows killed. This mass extermination of sparrows resulted in severe ecological imbalance when the sparrows were no longer there to be predators for various insects. Locust populations bloomed in echoes of exodus. Extreme imbalance plagued the Chinese ecosystem, altering the homes and livelihoods of millions of people. And though this country may not have the same drastic story about extermination of sparrows, we do have many records of raids against rats, the Colorado potato beetle, mosquitoes, the emerald ash borer, bed bugs, and other undesirables prone to be in our cities and under our feet and in our homes. And so knowing a little bit about this history of pest extermination in the United States and mourning the loss of so many sparrows, the irony was not lost on me this week as I had my own adventure with my own little undesirable, an 8-legged one, a multi-eyed one. And as surely as I've spent this week preparing this sermon on the psalm that begins so beautifully, "How lovely is your dwelling place, O God of heavenly forces," I spent half an hour trying to get up the courage to swat a too large arachnid that decided to traipse across my bathroom floor while I was brushing my teeth on Thursday night. This led me to go down yet another Google rabbit hole about giant house spiders, which, as you Seattleites know very well and seem to have left out of my job description, are a thing here. So lest you think that I only preach about snakes and crows and spiders, let's consider with hospitality the presence of these sometimes unwanted and less than loved critters that find their homes in rafters and tall trees and crawl spaces and floorboards. Are these unlegged and many-legged winged creatures less important to God than the precious sparrows which nest nearby the altar of the holy? Are these creepy crawlies and squawking scavengers to be devoid of house and home? God created these animals and insects, our neighbors, to be at home in this world just as much as we are created to be at home in this world. Our scripture today, Psalm 84, was probably composed to mark a pilgrimage to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. How lovely is the dwelling place of the Most High God, the pilgrims sang as they traveled toward the geographical center of their faith, their home away from home. This was in a time when people all over the ancient world made sense of their being through worshiping a diverse pantheon of gods and goddesses. Each god had their own particular gifts and abilities. Each god had a house. Different temples were constructed to worship different deities. The temple in Jerusalem was where the Israelites went to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who liberated them from their oppression under Egyptian rule, the God of David and his son Solomon, who saw fit to construct a temple, a beautiful home for God to dwell. God would no more be a wandering God, contained in the Ark of the Covenant and traveling from place to place as the 12 tribes of Israel searched for their home. In the temple Solomon built, the Ark of the Covenant would live in the Holy of Holies, the most sacred space where God's self dwells. When the Ark of the Covenant was placed into that holy room in the Jerusalem temple, Solomon said, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Even heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, much less this house that I have built." So, in other words, God has an address, but God is also free to get around and walk around a little bit. If this sounds a little weird, that the God of the cosmos could be made so small to dwell in one particular building in this one particular place, hear the words of our gathering hymn. Not just in buildings, dark and confining, not in some heaven light years away. Here in this place, the new light is shining. Now is God present, and now is the day. This hymn calls to us to consider the particularity of God, the creator, sustainer, and redeemer of the whole entire universe, enthroned in the heavens, breathing the breath of life into every single creature that slithers, crawls, walks, and flies, giving each bird its song, giving each rose its color, making the dry valleys flow with strong with fresh water. That creator also chooses to dwell in a particular place. For the Israelite people, that was the Ark of the Covenant and the temple in Jerusalem. This cultural backdrop is what the pilgrims were thinking about. God had a house, a literal physical location where they could go visit God, a place on the map. In a way, that sounds really nice to me. Here's a place I can go visit that will always be there, where God will always be found. It's God's home, and I am welcome here. But what does it mean to find a home in God's temple? Think of the psalmist Sparrow, who felt comfortable enough to nest near the temple, near the altar, perhaps right next to the Holy of Holies, despite all the hustle and bustle of temple priests and pilgrims paying tribute to the Most High God, and the organists warming up for Sunday worship, and people greeting each other, and people setting out cups for coffee hour. The temple of God, or the church of God, is often a really busy place. And yet we read that the sparrow finds enough comfort to build her nest, to lay her eggs, to prepare for the next generation. That kind of comfort is so needed in this world where we exterminate pests and alter habitats for drilling oil and natural gas, where people are plagued with wildfires that threaten their homes and livelihoods. To have a place where God is certain to be found, even as the natural world is changing and as the pilgrims remembered their time in exile. That certainty and that feeling of at-homeness provided the inspiration for this beautiful song of praise to God. But confining God to one location can also be limiting, because homes change, don't they? People beat pots and pans to stop sparrows from landing and making nests. We use brooms and heavy books and whatever sandals are nearby to squish any so-called intruding bugs. People lose their homes due to poor decisions, unfair management, natural disasters, rapidly shifting markets that make it uninhabitable for them. Homes change. The fires the past couple weeks have been reminders of this fact. And I've been thinking a lot about December of 2008 when my grandparents' house burned down to the ground. Thankfully, my grandparents were not at home at the time, only returning from their bowling league when someone told them that a house on West 4th Street was on fire. It was their home, and they found themselves at 80 years old, homeless. Some faulty wiring in the attic caught fire and burned their home of 55 years to the foundations, leaving just a few items that were damaged or burned. The family Bible was unable to be recovered. The bluebell china, one of the only valuable heirlooms, was all cracked, so Grandma wasn't able to give it to me like she had promised, a gift that has been passed down to the women in our family. Family photos that were able to be recovered still smell of smoke. My grandpa wasn't able to be buried this past spring with the flag he received when he was discharged from the Army. Though it was my grandparents who were faced with having to find a new home and rebuild their lives literally from the ground up, my whole family shared the experience of not being able to return home. The basement where we shared many Thanksgiving pies over the years, the living room where my cousins introduced me to the original trilogy of Star Wars, and the bedroom where I slept when I was sure I saw Rudolph's nose zipping by on a Christmas Eve, were all gone. That building that had been converted from a one-room Nazarene church to a home for my grandparents, 4 children, and many grandchildren and great-grandchildren was gone. The walls and carpets and windows and doors and items held within, mostly gone. In the days that followed, we had to relearn and recreate what home meant to my family. We could never go home to the same place again. We had to learn how to be home without a building. And that white-hot truth is facing so many people in California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia as the fires burn through our beautiful Pacific Northwest, sending smoke and some ash even as far as to cover our cars here in the city. That prickly truth also impacts countless flora and fauna residents of this bioregion. And yes, as forestry officials remind us, fire is not always destructive in a negative and desecrating way, as certain trees need fire in order to reproduce, in order for their seed pods and cones to open up and reveal the seeds of the next generation. But the fires make our temperatures and emotions rise uncontrollably, and the smoke makes it hard to see and breathe. We can't see familiar landscapes in front of us. We can't discern where we should go. The fire and the smoke obscures how we see our home. Perhaps enough to wonder why this is the new normal for our region. Perhaps enough to wonder how unhoused people in our city can make a home in this new normal. I recently learned about an app called Find It, Fix It, which purports to report selected issues to the city of Seattle. Do you all know about this? Have you heard it? Apparently on this app, you can report a pothole or a broken down car or a malfunctioning parking meter and anything else you find that fits the list of undesirable things in our city near our homes. But did you know that there are some people in our city who make this list of undesirables? I bet you know who they are. In a recent Atlantic article, a journalist interviewed neighbors in Seattle who reported unhoused people sleeping in public areas to city government using this Find It, Fix It app. Find it, fix it. How dehumanizing to refer to another being made in the image of God as an it. People are not to be found and fixed, they are to be embraced and enfolded and held. They are to be seen and heard and understood as precious vessels of the breath and creativity of God. They are to be treated with dignity and hospitality, to be shown compassion that soothes dry valleys with springs of living water. If the sparrow and the snake and the crow and the spider are welcome to nest near the altar of the Holy One, how much more are human beings welcome? The writer of our psalm today says, "One day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere." That is how good, how right, how true it felt to be even reaching the doorstep of the temple of God. How much safety, comfort, and hospitality touched even the courtyard of God's house, even the sidewalk. But let's go beyond this courtyard as we seek to welcome all people so that they might find welcome near the dwelling place of God. The incredible musicians of Sweet Honey in the Rock share these words in one of their songs. "There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. And the beauty that I saw in everything was in her eyes, like the rising of the sun." Perhaps the pilgrims reaching the outer courtyard of God, being just this close to God's dwelling place among the people, felt this way. The beauty of everything was in her eyes. And that's what it felt like to be home. And the composer of Psalm 84 knew some of this feeling too, knew that the Holy One was not only to be found in buildings confining and not in some heaven light years away. The psalmist also met God along the path to the temple, along the highways and byways, on the journey. As they passed through the dry valley of Baca, supposedly a deeply barren place, the psalmist writes that springs of water flourished in the deserted place. The psalmist saw the beauty in everything, never knowing that the valley was dry, never believing that water could never be found there again. This transformative view of what is dry being made fertile again spoke to the psalmist of God's presence with the pilgrims on their journey, of God's presence with the parched land. Perhaps Nana's house for Sweet Honey in the Rock speaks of God's house. No mirrors were present to enlarge the pieces of ourselves that society tells us are undesirable. No mirrors to make us question our belonging, our beauty, our worth. Perhaps we can also see the beauty in everything as we consider what it means to make home, what it means to feel home near the altar of the Lord, while understanding the Holy One as a dynamic, transformative, living God at work and out and about in the world. As one of my friends shared on a recent episode of the Theosophia podcast, why would God create this big, beautiful world if God didn't want us to find God there? Our God is both a God of all-encompassing love, justice, and mercy, as well as a God who chooses to particularly dwell with particular people. That this God is specific. This God calls our names. This God knows what we look like and what our favorite foods are and what fears we hold close to our hearts and where to find us when we have turned away from love. This God is dynamic, transformative, creative, and redemptive. This God is not only found in buildings that are dark and confining, not only in some future peace and prosperity in heaven. This God was alongside the pilgrims on the journey, transforming dry valleys as well as internal dry valleys. The pilgrims found God in the temple in Jerusalem, but they also met God on the journey. I imagine that all of the pilgrims found ways to find the dwelling place of God, even within their own hearts. And so wherever we are, let's make a home, and let's do it together. Let's make a home where we can sing the songs of our faith with gusto, where we can raise our children together in safety and wisdom. Let's make a home with no mirrors, where we don't seek external signs of our internal worth, but we see it reflected in each other's eyes and in each other's lives. Whether you dwell now in the place where your parents and grandparents lived and loved and worshiped, whether you are far away from those you love most in the world, geographically or otherwise, whether you have spiders in your sinks and bats in your balcony and crows sitting on your car, whether you have been separated by the veil of death from those who remind you who you are, let us remind each other, you are where God dwells, and we are where God dwells. There are no mirrors in God's house. No mirrors in God's house. The beauty I saw in everything, the beauty in everything is in God's eyes. May it ever be so.